Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Pablo and Conso, for inviting me to this. I think it's very exciting that ORCID is not just everything in English. So I'm from Germany, and we will have a kind of similar meeting in a few weeks, which will all be sessions in German, because I think ORCID and author identification is really an international problem. So please, if you ask your questions in Spanish or Catalan, that's totally fine with me if I don't understand anything, if somebody translates that. I want to give a brief overview of what ORCID is doing and of what ORCID is planning to do. And I just want to talk very briefly about the problem we are all trying to solve, and that's name ambiguity, which means if you just take the name of the person, it's impossible to really make sure it's always the same person, whether this is just about people at the university, whether it's about publications, whether anything that people do as researchers or scholars. And I think you can do tricky things with English-speaking people, like to use their second first name to make them more unique, and that sometimes works, unless your name is Smith. If you're Spanish, you know this much better than I do, people always get confused about people having more than one last name, and then English systems, they don't like that. And then there are countries like China, which just they don't have many last names, or Korea. So I think there's lots of Kims and Wongs, and it's just impossible to really figure out who is who. So it's really the only solution to this problem is really to give people a number, which doesn't really sound very attractive, but I think that's what we have to do. Because this is all about the scholarly record. That's sort of a picture, an idea by Jeff Bilder from Crossweb, and I really like that. So the scholarly record means whatever we do as scholars, we want to sort of have a track record of this, and today this of course means it's digital, so that you can see all the connections of who is collaborating with whom, who is working on what particular topic area and so forth. And there are just a lot of the things we are interested in depend on that, and just one of 1,000 examples would just be if you run an institutional repository and you want to make sure that all the publications of your faculty are in there. It's of course much nicer if all these things are connected. And that's of course not the case right now, so the scholarly record is broken, and one of the problems, really, it's not the only problem, is author identification, and ORCID has tried to help solve that problem. And of course, there are many other initiatives trying to solve the same problem, and we will hear about Amanda in a moment, what the Names project is doing. I here listed a few things, sort of what is unique about ORCID, or why there is just another initiative. I mean, ORCID started as an idea in November 2009 as an organization in September 2010, so that's still fairly recent. And some of the driving ideas behind starting ORCID and doing ORCID are listed here. I mean, I think the top one is probably the most important one, that this is a really important concept, and this is impossible to do by a single, for example, commercial entity. So there are several commercial systems that provide author identifiers, but it's really difficult to build a system around something that's owned by one company. And organizations that have built these systems, they realize that the only way to do this is really by a non-profit organization that's sort of transparent, where everybody can get involved and make decisions. And the second important reason to start ORCID and to move forward is really that ORCID is global. There are many initiatives for name identifiers that are just specific for a discipline. So for example, economics has REPEC for quite some time, so they have solved this problem for themselves. But of course, disciplines are not really closed, but there's lots of overlap to other disciplines, and it would just be impossible to have a different identifier for every discipline. The same is true for countries. So some countries have really done a lot of work much earlier than ORCID in creating a national author identifier. I think Lattes in Brazil is one very good example. The Netherlands has a Dutch digital author identifier, but then again, research is not restricted to specific countries. So lots of publications have co-authors from different countries, and there are all kinds of international collaborations. So national author identifier is very important, and we will talk about this later today, but it's not possible to only have national author identifiers. Another aspect of ORCID which is related to trustworthiness is really openness, so that ORCID tries to be open as much as possible, and this means, for example, that the ORCID software is open source software, that the data that are collected are available, at least the public data, not data that researchers don't want to be public. And then the last 2 points are really about that it's important to integrate ORCID into other systems. So it's not enough to just provide a registry where you can create a number for an author, and then this registry just sits there, but you really have to build systems that use this author identifier, and for that you of course need the help of many organizations that use these numbers. So a number in itself is never really interesting, it's always the connection between the number for a researcher to his publication, for example. Without this connection, it's really not very interesting to just have a number. But that's all I want to talk about, more general things, because what is really more exciting from my perspective is to not talk about ideas and how to run all this, but to really launch the service, and that has taken quite some time, longer than everybody thought, of course, but we plan to launch ORCID next month. So that's really in the near future, so that starting October 15, unless there is a last-minute problem, every researcher can go to the ORCID website and register an ORCID ID, and everybody can use that. And that's something special, and we're really excited about that. And that this, of course, doesn't mean we have solved all the problems, but I think it's much easier to talk a system that's already running and sort of make it better than continue planning and thinking for a few more years. And what I want to talk about mostly today, in the rest of the time I have, is to talk about what's happening after October 15. I want to talk about adoption, about integration and interoperability, and I will come to what I mean by that. And for adoption, I would like to remind you that we wrote a really nice paper last year already, thinking about adoption as a problem. And the problem is really, it's nice to have author identifiers, but for many people they're only useful if a lot of researchers have a number. So this means that the beginning is really tricky, and it's what in economics research is called a collective action problem. So it would be nice if everybody would be doing this, and then we would also start joining ORCID. So we probably wait until everybody else has joined, and then we can also use ORCID in our systems. And that, of course, is not working, because then everybody is waiting and nothing really happens. And 5 years from now, ORCID is still a nice idea. And that's a problem that is well known to economics. And there are many examples where this happens, and also how to solve this. And I think the solutions that these people provide are also helpful for us, and that's what we wrote in this paper. And the basic idea is really that having an ORCID identifier is useful in many different ways for the different people and organizations involved in this. And this is a table from this paper. And this basically says that there are different use cases. And for example, the first use case, which is a researcher creates, for example, a manuscript and submits this to a publisher. This is something where the publisher can use the ORCID identifier right now. So this system is useful as it is, because you can make the workflow a little bit easier and everything, and I will talk about this in a moment. But for this to work, you don't need 1 million other people have an ORCID ID. You just need your manuscript submissions. You make your life easier if you use numbers for authors. And then this is all about new research created, and that, of course, there's a lot of research that has already happened, and we want to go back and see that we can connect people to their works. And the easiest step there, of course, is to use all these systems that exist already that have done this work. So other author identifier services, or, of course, a lot of universities have kept track of what their researchers are doing, and it would just be fairly easy to just import these profiles into the ORCID system. And for these organizations that have already done this work, then they have the information they have collected. They don't have to start again from zero and collect all this again, but they can use it in the ORCID system, and then there can be added information, and they don't have to collect all this themselves. So a good example is universities keeping track of their researchers. The next step, that's really already more difficult, is just for things that have not been connected. So really to go back and find out, for example, what has a researcher working in the university, what has he published the last 10 years? And this is hard work. And the sort of motivation is less important than for things that have not been published yet. And this is mainly manual work that either a researcher can do himself or his institution can do for him. And these are things that are a little bit more difficult and probably will happen over time, not at the very beginning. And the last stage is really things of people that have stopped publishing. So it would be nice to have an ORCID identifier for Albert Einstein, for example, and to really sort of track his works and all the connections to other people that did research 100 years ago. But that's really not something that ORCID wants to solve the beginning, or any other author identifier service. And for that, you really need probably computer algorithms that do most of the work for you. I mean, I think at some stage this will happen, just as the Crossref has assigned DOIs to the philosophical transactions, the first sort of journal articles from 1665. So maybe at some point Isaac Newton will have an ORCID, but a little bit later. So to summarize what I just said, and it was a little bit complicated, but it's important because when ORCID launches in October and you go then in January, you shouldn't expect that there are 1 million ORCID identifiers. I think this will be a slow process, and I think it's important to be realistic and to really make one step at the time. And I think the initial focus will really be on anything new research, so that it's really important that ORCID identifiers are integrated in all these workflows. And this is not just journals, but also data centers, so submission of data sets and linking them to author identifiers. And the other area is, of course, import existing author profiles, both from other services and from institutions that have done this work already. And after we spoke about this, I think it makes sense if you better understand the list of launch partners. So that's the organization that have committed to be part of ORCID when the service launches, and they're already working now with the sort of technical integration of their systems with ORCID. Because it's not simply about saying, I like to be part of ORCID, but it's a lot of hard work to really go into the technical details. And I think there are some organizations that are well known and some less so, and I think the list, it's clear this is a lot about organizations that either publish manuscripts where this is useful, that handle these kind of information in other ways and have their own author identifier services. Of course, a few of these names are all, these organizations have been very involved in ORCID from the beginning, for example, on the ORCID board. And you also see that there are fairly few universities or research organizations. And I think there are many reasons for that. One is really the technical challenges of building something like this. And another one is really what I spoke about, the incentives. So to make the jump to provide ORCIDs for all your faculty, that's a really big jump. And it's a much bigger jump than saying, okay, from January 1st, all new manuscripts, the authors should provide an ORCID ID. So moving forward is always easier. And the challenges for universities in particular, and that's just my perspective, and my perspective is really working at a fairly small German university as a researcher. Although I have, I'm spending too much time with these things now. But I think when you want to integrate ORCIDs, the first thing you really need is an internal system. And I think, so the CRIS system would be sort of what I mean by that. Of course, this could have many different names. But if you don't know who's working for you and what they have published, and you have a system to track this internally, then it's really difficult to integrate ORCIDs, because you still need your local system of tracking all these this information, and it's much easier if you have this already than if you have just a Word document with names and publications. Then the second challenge is what I mentioned, that the registry, the data that are in the ORCID system are more useful over time. So right now, if an institution has spent a lot of time collecting this information, then there's relatively little value for them to just put this into the ORCID system. This will be very different in 1 or 2 years when, for example, the researchers at a university, they continue to publish and their manuscript have ORCID IDs, so that, for example, whenever they publish something new, you're automatically notified and you don't have to run around and track those publications. And then the third challenge is, of course, membership fees. This service has to cost money, and this is, of course, easier for some organizations than for others. And I think that's part of the focus of the discussion later today. It's important to remember that there are only two people or two kinds of organizations that can create an ORCID identifier, and that's the researcher himself and that's the institution he works for. Nobody else can create an ORCID identifier, not a publisher, not a funder, not a commercial organization. And this is the status as of 2012, and this is not something that has to be like this a few years from now, and there are two important reasons for this. Number one, and that's really the biggest reason, is privacy, and we really want a researcher to say it's okay that you create a number for me. And this is not only because ORCID wants to be nice, but because you run into all kinds of legal problems if you just create numbers for people and don't tell them. And this is probably more important in the European Union than in the United States or in other countries, but that's one big reason. And institutions that are employers of researchers, they can, if they say we have the permission of our researchers and ORCID will not track down what exactly that means, then that's also okay, because usually that's a relationship, and then there's probably a researcher has agreed to this in one way or another in most places. The second reason why this is limited to these two organizations is technical. So just imagine if starting October 15, everybody would create ORCID identifiers. Then in a few weeks, we will have the same person in the system maybe 10 times, and then we would start to think about how we sort this all out. And that's something that the ORCID software will be able to do, but not in the first version. So the next big version change will allow you to automatically disambiguate these things, and then it would be technically possible to just create ORCID identifiers from all kinds of places and then just make sure that they are all linked to each other. But they're just, so from a technical side, it was just a limitation of what you can build into the system that's launching in October. And that was just not possible because it's really a big problem. So the big question that nobody really knows is what researchers will do when ORCID launches. And I think ORCID, because the perspective is really, for example, the people working in the ORCID board, in the working group, these are mostly people that deal with sort of information infrastructure in one way or another, whether they are a university or a funder or a publisher. But we don't really know what researchers will do. So whether they will be all excited, and there is an interesting factor to author identifiers, which the Dutch have really understood well, because they called their service Narcis, which means that a lot of researchers just like to show what they do. So I'm sure there will be people just go there and just spend a lot of time listing all their 20 publications and so forth. But we really don't know. And I think we underestimate what researchers will do. So it's very possible that that there will be a lot of activity of researchers, and it's not really an issue of getting enough people signing up for this. I mean, you have to understand that the ORCID software is based on researcher ID code. It was licensed from Thomson Reuters, and researcher ID is very much a self-claimed system. So it's really a system built that a researcher goes there, registers, and lists his publication. And it wasn't really built for other organizations to put in data, and that is something that has been added in the last year and will continue to be added. So that's something we don't know. And this also means that if you are an organization that wants to be participant, but you don't have the technical resources to implement ORCID infrastructure right now, you need more time, or you don't want to become a member right now, for example, because of the cost, then you can just tell every researcher you're working with, please go and register in ORCID, and then you can use this information and do something. Because ORCID is not a club where you have to be a member to sort of see the benefits. I think the membership model is really more a balancing act, that it would be good if everything would be free and open, but that's not realistic because it costs money to run this. And ORCID has received some grants from National Science Foundation and others, but it's not enough to run this service. So the membership model is really make enough of this freely available that it's useful for everybody, but for things that are nice to have, you have to be a member and pay money. And nice to have is mostly about authentication with the system and sort of better technical integration. And that means, for example, if a university wants to create ORCID records on behalf of the people they work for them, then you have to be a member because that's really a technical integration. And similar, if you're a publisher and want to integrate ORCIDs into your manuscript submission system, you have to do the technical integration. If you just tell your authors in your manuscript submission system, please create an ORCID ID and come back, then you don't have to be a member. So you can also do that. And the same is true for funding organizations and other places where you need ORCIDs. So for example, a repository, the nice way would be a nice technical solution where you just click and are forward to the ORCID website and you come back, but that you have to be a member, but you can also just have an input field with the ORCID ID. So ORCID is always free for individual researchers to create records, to update their records, and it's also always free to search. And public data is just meaning that come to that data that are not where the researcher hasn't said this is private, so I don't want to share this, or I only want to share this with specific organizations. There's also a public data dump once a year, so you can take all the ORCID data and do something with them. That's also not requiring membership. So there are a lot of things you can do, and I think, so for example, my university is a medical school, so it's a small university, and Hanover Medical School will not become a member, at least right now, because it's just complicated for a small university and also expensive. So at the same time, we can just ask everybody to use ORCIDs. And this is sort of further extension of membership, that the technical infrastructure, the APIs, there are two different APIs. One is sort of for everybody to use. So there are things you can build into your systems which don't require you to be a member, and this is, for example, a search interface to ORCID. But everything that requires authentication and that requires updating the ORCID database from a different system, that requires membership. And you can, we can discuss this in the afternoon, where this is a smart idea to structure membership like this. But I think it's the best we can do, because it's not realistic that a funding organization or a government just gives ORCID enough money that this is free for everybody. Related to this is what I briefly mentioned before, privacy, that there are 3 different levels of privacy: public information, limited information, and private information. So limit is something that you only want to share with your funding organization, for example. You can sort of, as a researcher, click the buttons in the system, say this is, nobody should know this, but the organization will submit my grant. There are some things that we don't want to have in the ORCID system because it's just too difficult with privacy. And for example, things like birth dates, that's really a problem. So, and what you also see here is the idea of a proxy. So if you're a member as an institution, then I said you can create ORCID records for your researchers, and the proxy is the person who would be doing that. So for example, the library could be set up to maintain the ORCID records of their researchers, or the research administration office, and the proxy would just be the person who has the rights to access the account. And this is one example of integration that I mentioned before. So the researcher submits a manuscript, and then how this manuscript flows through the manuscript tracking system of a publisher, and then when it's hopefully accepted in the end, that the metadata, including the ORCID identifier, is also forwarded to Crossref, and then from Crossref to ORCID. So when you submit a manuscript, and of course it's accepted, that at some stage this information ends up in the ORCID system and nobody has to do anything. And that's the nice aspect of this integration, that really it adds value. You don't have to constantly run around and track citations and link them to the ORCID identifier, but this will over time happen more or less automatically. A similar workflow we can skip over this because it's already late, is of course possible with funding organizations. And there are many other workflows where you can integrate ORCID IDs. For example, institutional repositories is another good place where you can think about how you set this up in a way that it's really as painless as possible for everybody involved. And the last topic I briefly want to mention is interoperability. And this means two things. Basically, it means that the ORCID system has to interoperate with manuscripts, how they are generated and published, reported, etc. So this relates mostly to DOIs, for Crossref DOIs more specifically. The same is true for data and data side DOIs. And then there's another aspect of interoperability with funding and grant applications. And this is again, what we briefly spoke about, that's right now is probably a little bit messy, so there isn't really a unique identifier for grants or anything like that yet. But this interoperability is really about how these different systems talk to each other. And there's another aspect that, of course, there isn't just one identifier for authors. ORCID is just one of many, and there is not just one identifier for publications or for data. So Crossref DOIs are very common, but there are many publications that don't have DOIs, and there are data sets that have data side DOIs, or they have all kinds of other identifiers. And it's really a challenge, and that's just, that's work for 10 years, to link the different author identifiers together and to link author identifiers to data and the publications. And this is not just a problem of ORCID, but that is a problem of this whole community. And there are many ways you can do this. And one specific way of sort of working on this is the ODIN project, which is an EU-funded project where we were supposed to start September 1st, and we have done all the paperwork, but it's hopefully happening very soon, and we will have a kick-off event next month. And ODIN is specifically about linking ORCID identifiers to data-set identifiers. It's difficult to see, so below ODIN you see the project partners, which is DataCite, ORCID, British Library, CERN, and a few external partners. ANDS, the Australian National Data Service, DRIAD, which is a data repository for biological data, and Archive, which is a preprint server for physics and related disciplines. So we try in this project in the next 2 years try to solve some of these issues, and of course we'll talk to everybody in this space. But I think this is not something that can be solved in 2 years. And that's my last slide. So in the 3rd week of October, we have the next ORCID outreach meeting in Berlin. And this will be the week when we want to launch the service. Not everybody can come to Berlin, unfortunately. But similar to here, you can also sign up and call in using WebEx. So will not be live streaming, but you have the audio and you can see the slides when you're at home or at work. And with that, I want to conclude. I think there isn't that much time left for questions, but thank you for your attention.
Hello, Martin. I have a question related with the when somebody wants to search another guy in the ORCID system, I understand you enter the system and I want to search what is the Martin Fenner ORCID, for example. So I introduce Fenner in the surname and there is a ORCID ID who appears me. The question is how I'm sure that this ORCID belongs to Martin Fenner, because anyone can introduce the data and I think it's a weak in the system.
I think that's a very good question. I don't think ORCID will try to sort of issue identifiers similar to ID cards, so that you go and then prove that this person is really who this person is. But that's, of course, I mean, you can look at this different ways. You could also say that this is just a name. So the system will, for example, linking to a publication, this is something that in the beginning you can say these are my 100 publications and I'm Albert Einstein. But over time there will be more trust in the system, so that, for example, for a new manuscript the publisher will say this is the person, this is really by Martin Fenner, and the university will say, yeah, this is really by Martin Fenner, and that's how you build trust, not by having a step in the beginning where you sort of verify everything, because that's not easy. I mean, how would you do that? You could, for example, say all the ORCID identifiers that are created by university for their researchers, that there's more trust in this, but it's also not working all the time.
Thank you.
Hi, Martin. Thank you for your time. I have a question. Probably I misunderstand this, but you have to be a member of the ORCID organization if you want to submit your number or your ID with your papers? Along with your, no.
No, I think if you're a researcher, you never have to be a member, so you can just use these numbers as individual. And everybody can use these numbers, so a publisher can just use ORCIDs, but if you want to do this integration with the ORCID system, with authentication and these things, then you have to be a member. But if you just have a manuscript submission system where you have a field where you enter your, then...
Hi, Martin. This might be a question for Philip as well, because I'm asking about researcher ID and those companies that already offer their author identification systems. Researcher ID at the moment is nice because you claim the papers that you think are yours, and those are allocated to your ID. And then the system learns, so it learns about where you are and so on. And next time you log in, it gives you a list of other papers that you might have published that it thinks are yours as well. How is it up to each of the commercial organizations then to change and stop using their own researcher ID and offer something similar using the ORCID ID, or how are they going to adapt?
Well, I think I can only answer half of the question, but I think I would say the ORCID system provides basic functionality. For example, there is a search interface, so when you register you can search for your publications using Crossref, and other services will be added over time. But it's clear that the ORCID system doesn't want to be the all-in-one system that serves every need. So Thomson Reuters and Elsewhere, Scopus, they all will have their own systems that have other features, for example, integration, Web of Science and Scopus. And I'm sure there, if you look at the list of launch partners, there are other organizations doing interesting things with ORCID IDs. Then this will be sort of added services.
One more question, sorry. I forgot. I suppose you've got some rules to apply when you have a conflict between, I mean, you have 2 or 3 authors claiming for the same piece of paper when there's only one author, things like that. When you have, are you solving this problem, or are the institutions solving these problems? Or?
I think this is one of the problems on the list we don't want to solve in October 2012 because it's difficult. And I think the basic thinking what ORCID wants to do in the next version is with this ambiguation that it's that we just collect all these claims and then we just say, okay, so for example, 3 people claim to be the same John Smith, but only one of them, the university said, yeah, this is really the John Smith, and the publisher, that's really this one, and this is why ORCID will figure out which one sort of it is, because otherwise it's really, I mean, you don't want to get into the business of sort of contacting all these people, talking to them, trying to understand which one has the best claims, because that's a painful business.
Hello, I'm from Universitat Oberta de Catalunya. I would like to know a little bit about membership fees for institutions, because if we are interested to use for repositories or CRIs or everything, we would like to know about fees. Thank you.
I try to avoid talking about specific numbers, and that's basically because I'm not, I mean, because it's a problem. So the idea, so that before I tell you, let's just explain the thinking behind this. So the idea was you want to start with this service and start with the membership model that's pretty simple, and that unfortunately means there's one fee for small universities and one for large universities. And I think 90% of European universities will be in the small university category, and that's unfortunately $4,000 a year, which is not a lot of money if you are Harvard, or, well, they are not in the small university category, but that's a lot of money, and for example, that's too much for my institution. We had a lot of discussion about this, and I think the idea is really to, that larger universities will have it much easier to be launch partners, and that this will be changing over time. So for example, if we see that a lot of universities wants to join, but it's just too much, then I'm sure this will change and there will be a discussion. So my recommendation, that's what I try to sort of say in my talk, is I would just use the system as it is, without being a member, and then if you see a clear benefits, and have your technical infrastructure and the CRIS and so forth, then I think you should talk to Laura Haag, the executive director, or to me, and I think this is all negotiable. There is also a price for consortia, but so unfortunately that is not so much cheaper. So I think it's a when I was having breakfast today, I think I saw a speech. I couldn't understand anything, but the Spanish economics minister having a meeting with a German, and I think they have different problems right now than paying for these things. So I totally understand that this is difficult.
Hi, Martin. October, when you launched the ORCID, Martin Fenner would have a new ID starting October. But what happens to all your past publications over the last so many years and the thousands of others? Whose responsibility is it to disambiguate this data and then get it into the ORCID system? Because if your past data is still not good enough, how do you foresee the success of this initiative in the future?
Well, as you can imagine, I will create an ORCID identifier, and I have publications, and I will probably, I haven't thought about this, maybe I just import from Scopus, and then sort of say, well, because Scopus is automated, there are a few mismatches, so that's not me, and then I will add a few my own, where Scopus didn't find them, and everybody can do that. So if you take the extra time and prefer nice enough interface, it's not too difficult. You can just import from other profiles and search Crossref and add the publication. And I'm sure that, or I hope enough researchers are interested in doing that.
And would the institution also play a role in doing this in terms of large data, cleansed data uploads, or?
Well, if the institution becomes a member, then the institution can sort of send an email to all their faculty saying, we are registering ORCIDs for you, are you okay? And we upload all the information we have in our quiz to ORCID, and please check whether this is okay, and just things like that. So you can do all that.
Hi, Martin. You mentioned CRIS systems would be a requirement for, I don't know whether requirement is too strong for ORCID implementation at institutional level. I'm aware there is, the Serif data model run by Eurocris is being now enhanced in order to have the ORCID ID in there, as well as the Scopus ID and researcher ID in a single entity, say. What about those institutions who don't have a CRIS system running right now? We had a meeting from a repository point of view, would a good strategy be for ORCID implementation to recommend researchers at your institution to become researcher, to get their researcher IDs, for instance, since it will be imported in a way into the ORCID system at some point after launch?
I think CRIS system is not a requirement in a strict sense. What I wanted to say is that the university has to have some system of tracking their researchers and their research output internally, because otherwise it's just very difficult. But this doesn't have to be a sort of certified CRIS system, but if it's just, for example, the institutional repository, if this is the place where the university knows what's happening, then that's fine. And how you use the other author identifier systems, that's probably really depending on the situation, whether it makes, because there's a lot of information in other systems, and if you are, for example, have used research ID in the past and have all the information in there, then it's of course helpful to link that to ORCID.
So I tell my researchers to go and get their ORCID ID. And what if this researcher already have his ORCID ID and he didn't know that because of whatever?
No, that's not possible. That's what I said.
That's not possible.
It's not possible to create ORCID IDs without the researcher knowing.
No, the researcher is creating his own ORCID ID. So there is another institution who created it before him. No, that's not possible. Are you sure of that?
Well, there will be special circumstances when somebody works at 3 places at once for reasons, but I think you can just assume the researcher knows if he has an ORCID ID, and I think that's the intention, not only for privacy, but I think it just makes more sense. This is not something that should happen behind the back of the researcher.
And Thomas Baget, I am running a system, I think, IRALIS, that is a system for identifying Spanish authors. And this list, we have already 3,500 records, and this is the authority list for authors for the ELIS repository. So we like to ask all members who are registered in IRALIS, ask the permission, and then assign ORCIDs. Do we have to pay for this? We have to pay a membership for this, being as 100% non-profit?
I think this is two important questions, and one is of course always about the membership, and the other one is can an organization like yours put in data into the ORCID system. And we had a long discussion about this in the ORCID board. For example, CERN, or the high energy physics community, they have a lot of this information. But mainly because of privacy, we decided this only is possible if there's permission by the researcher, which technically means something like an email where you have to click, this is okay. And if you do that, then in principle, the researcher is creating his identifier himself. You're just sort of helping him, and then that's not really membership. Membership would be if you sort of have the rights to change the records and everything. But if you just have a list of researchers and you want to get them an ORCID ID, I think there's something that can be worked out. If you want to do this without their permission, it's tricky. Thank you.